Welcome to our panel from Trace Press on River in an Ocean. We're really excited to be here with the National Center for Writing and for the British Center for Literary Translation, and all of you I know who've been attending events this week. So it's really an honor to be here. I wanted to thank Kate Griffin from the National Center for Writing, Anna Good from the British Center for Literary Translation, and especially Mayada Ibrahim, who is a friend of Trace, who's also been responsible for organizing some of the panels and for inviting us here today. So it's lovely to be here. I can't see the audience, but please know that we are very aware of you. We are going to ask you right from the beginning. You can chat with each other in the chat, but when it comes to the Q&A at the end, which is a big part of this event, please use the Q&A function because it gets confusing for us. Okay, so to start off with, I'm going to just begin with how we normally begin at Trace, which is to locate ourselves. We are based as a small press in Toronto, on Turtle Island. And right from the beginning at Trace, these are questions we think a lot about that are part of what we're going to discuss today. So we ask our writers, our translators, our artists, readers, and audiences to question borders and unsettle various forms of local and global colonialism and coloniality. We're grateful to do our work in Toronto in solidarity with diverse Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island who continue to gather upon the traditional lands of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat. This territory from which I am speaking, because we are located, even though we're disembodied here in this virtual space, it is a space. I have a room behind me, I have shelves, and there's a lake on that side. To the south, this territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The question for us gathered here, as Indigenous to other parts of the world as well, and I know, for example, Lisa is right now coming from Kigali, Yasmin from Nazareth, Nidra and I are both located here in Toronto, whether we're refugee and immigrant settlers here, is of course, what is our relationship to the space of Turtle Island that we all have connections to, and also how do we transform our relationship to land, to extraction, and to the ideas of settlement. And how does this also come into play when we think about translation, I think is very much part of the question that this collection takes up as well. So we welcome you to this panel for River in an Ocean. I'm Nizhat Abbas. I'm the founder of Trace Press and also the publisher and also the editor of this anthology. As you can see, we're a small underfunded press where few people do a lot of things, but a lot of it is done in community and in collaboration. And we are growing. We do have lots of other people involved, designers, editors, proofreaders, and so on and so forth. And it's a growing community of wonderful translators. We focus primarily on translations from the Global South and diaspora, but we also do literary nonfiction. We're getting kind of interested in doing poetry now because we keep on getting requests to do so. We do love poetry at Trace Press. So I'm going to describe myself because I was asked to, and it's good practice. I'm an older person. I don't know how you describe that, but figure it out depending on how old you are in the audience. I think that depends. I'm wearing a white top with Ethiopian embroidery on it. There's a bookshelf behind me. I have kind of grayish mixed colored hair, dark. And I'm wearing a necklace that you can't see, which is like a tawiz where you put in some verses to keep you safe. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm going to introduce our other speakers, and maybe they can also describe themselves. I'm going to start with, in the order in which they're going to speak. Dr. Lisa Ndujuru holds a transdisciplinary PhD from Concordia University and a permit for psychotherapy from, I forget the name of the institution that gave you your order, but you can tell us. Her extensive experimentation with storytelling, play, and improvised theater aims for individual and collective meaning making and empowerment. She works with survivors of large-scale political violence to create accessible, scalable, non-medicalized strategies for healing and change. Her dissertation, Oral History and Performance in the Aftermath of Large-Scale Violence, and epistemological contribution, won the Concordia University Distinguished Doctoral Dissertation Prize in the Social Science category. She was one of the 2017 Concordia Public Scholars and the first John F. Lemieux Fellow for Genocide Studies in 2018, and a Provost postdoctoral fellow in the University of Toronto's Faculty of Information in 2020. Lisa is currently activating an archive of Rwandan pre-colonial Ibitekerezo wisdom tales. And her paper that she wrote for us in River and Ocean describes that whole process. And I'm sure right now she's in Kigali and thinking in more complicated ways about all of that. So Lisa, did you want to describe yourself?
Absolutely. So I am a Black woman with gray braids, big glasses. My dress is made of African cloth in red and black with a yellow trim. My background is faint because where I am, it is dark and the light is in my face. So the background is kind of, yeah, you can't really see it very well. That's for me.
The next person I'm going to invite is Yasmin. Yasmin Haj was born in Nazareth, Palestine, and is a writer, editor, and translator. She co-founded Dalala, a translation collective of art, cinema, and critical and literary text. They have a website, do check them out. She's also the co-editor of Mitra, a multilingual review of arts and literature. She currently works as an editorial coordinator and translator at Mafradat. Her writings and translations have appeared in Asafir al-Arabi, Asymptote, Best American Experimental Writing, Roman, Specimen, the Babel Review of Translations, Turning Point Books, and TNI, and in projects supported by the Imqatan Foundation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Yasmin. I am sitting in a room with a cream-colored curtain, olive colored wall, I think, but it doesn't show. It maybe looks like it's more gray. I have short curly hair, wearing a black cardigan and some navy blue top. I'm not sure if I'm older or younger, but I do feel very old. And thank you for being here.
Thank you. And Nidra Rodrigo is the founder of the Tamil Studies Symposium at York University and the bilingual event series, the TamFam Lit Jam, which is this very energetic, fabulous series that takes place in Toronto, but it's also kind of transnational sometimes, where young different generations of Tamil writers, readers, artists get together and read. She's also a member of the board of directors for the Tamil Community Center project, which is building a big community center in Toronto right now. Her published translations include In the Shadow of a Sword from Sage Books in Yoda, volumes 1, 2, and now I think it's 3 and 4, or is it 5, of the Devakantan Quintet, Prison of Dreams from Mawenzi. Her essays have appeared in Kalam, Briarpath, Sea Magazine, Studies in Canadian Literature and Human Rights in the Arts, Essays on Global Asia, and her translations of poetry in Words and Worlds, January Lit, Still We Sing, Voices on Violence Against Women, and in Human Rights in the Arts in Global Asia. Welcome, Nidra.
I'm an older brown woman, medium melanated, as the kids say these days, with gray curly hair that has sort of surrendered to the humidity and turned into a cloud. I am wearing a mauve and green dress, and I'm seated in my basement. There's a screen behind me and a door behind that, where my son is trying his very best to be quiet. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of now turn to the book and why we're all here. It's also the anniversary of this book that we launched almost a year ago in June. We started off with a series of conversations in May 2023, so it's been a whole year. We've had lots of conversations, events following the book, and it's been remarkable to see how the book has resonated across the world, because I keep on getting messages and emails, and there've been a lot of reviews written, and it's meant something, I think, to a lot of translators and writers, and oddly enough, poets seem to love this book. So it's had a life of its own, and I'm very grateful to all the readers. I wanted to say something about the title and the cover, because I keep on thinking about it. The original project was called Unsettling Translation, and this title came to me in a dream, literally, or a waking dream, and it's based on the painting or a series of artworks by Lala Rook, a Pakistani artist who had passed away in 2017, who was a very close friend of my partner's. And I was thinking a lot about Lala during that whole period. Like this anthology came together during the pandemic and sort of in the afterlife or during the Black uprisings, which went from 2016 onwards and which have kind of gotten co-opted in really interesting ways, but also the backlash that we're living through right now. So I think it made, as somebody who's older, who grew up in the aftermath of the 60s decolonial movements, the anti-colonial movements, I was trying to sort of think of connections between all of that and also what it meant in terms of writing and translation. And so the people I invited to contribute to this anthology were people whose thoughts I was interested in, who I felt engaged with a lot of the questions that concern me. So I'm really glad that they all agreed to participate in this project. I'm very grateful to Françoise Vergès, who wrote a beautiful foreword where she also explores her own thoughts around translation, writing, language, and what it means to grow up in the axis of multiple cultures, which is the Indian Ocean, which is also where I come from the island of Zanzibar, but also through exile and many displacements. So I'm just going to kind of read out a little bit from the introduction, and then I'm going to ask Lisa to start us off with a short reading, and then they can all read and we'll have a discussion. What and where is the time and place of translation, and of literary translation in particular, of the translator as writer, as attentive listener, as co-creator, responsible to what Spivak calls the trace of the other within the self, or of the editor-publisher as a convener and gatherer in the project? This anthology emerges from such a questioning and from curious and communal conversation to offer a space for the soundings of different trajectories, connecting spaces, times, languages, and bodies with origins in East Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. Why these geographies? A simple personal reason is that these are geographical, political, historic, and symbolic landscapes that I, as editor, am most familiar with, landscapes inhabited and traversed from childhood, but also through years of reading and study, deeply rooted in what Françoise Vergès, a fellow dweller of the Indian Ocean that I call home, describes as this millenary cultural space on the Africa-Asia axis, so rich with history. I'm kind of thinking also about a section in the introduction, which I think is relevant right now in the current moment we're living in, of how this question of translation of this book as a whole was imagined as a small vessel, an improvised container for critical and creative questions, for contemplation, for decolonial, anti-racist, feminist, queer, and trans dissonance, refusal and rebellion, for care and community as we write, make, and resist within the shifting conditions of an ongoing global pandemic, environmental catastrophes, growing fascism, and conflicts large and small, alongside the uncountable dead, the disabled, and the orphaned. So this was then, a year ago. It's even more relevant now. And I kind of asked the panelists today here to think through what translation may mean in the context of memory and erasure as well. So all three of them have written very eloquently, have spent their entire lives thinking about these questions. And so I'm going to ask Lisa to start us off today.
So my piece is called "And the Heart Became Child." The context. Shortly before Rwanda's independence from colonial rule in 1962, a Belgian historian supervised an extensive anthrohistorical project throughout Rwanda. The project involved collecting more than 1,000 ibitekerezo, orally transmitted knowledge wisdom stories, from traditional knowledge keepers and storytellers. These priceless traces of Rwanda's cultural history were preserved at a critical moment between 1957 and 1961. They were collected by historian Jan Vansina, then director of the Institut de Recherche en Afrique Centrale, a colonial Belgian research institution stationed in Rwanda and the Congo during this time. Vansina left the country before the work was completed. However, the collection of ibitekerezo carries his name and is known as the Vansina collection. The 1959-1962 period was a tumultuous time, both in Rwanda and more broadly in the rest of Africa, as former colonizing nations and the churches sought to protect their assets and privileges. Rwanda had been colonized by the German Empire and became a Belgian protectorate after Germany's defeat in the First World War. After the Second World War, Cold War adversaries sought influence and resources on the continent and supported the efforts of various countries towards decolonization. Belgium was already exploiting neighboring Congo. If the Rwandan process towards independence was granted too early or was left to Rwandan traditional governance, it might have triggered similar requests for autonomy from neighboring Burundi or, more importantly, Belgian Congo. The Congo, 5 times the size of Belgium, is and has been one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources. The Belgian plan for Rwanda became therefore to replace the Tutsi elite created by the German colonizer and to enact indirect rule by a Hutu elite sympathetic to Belgian interests and oversight. For the Catholic Church, the Cold War meant the threat of communism, and communism was conflated with the nationalist tendency of a Catholic-schooled Tutsi minority coming of age to demand independence and sovereignty. The Catholic Church would thus align with the Belgian plan to replace this Tutsi minority with a Hutu minority sympathetic to colonial and church interests. In July 1959, Mwami Mutara, so Mwami is the traditional ruler, was killed or died in mysterious circumstances after a visit to the Belgian administrator. The traditional council of elders, the Abiru, quickly crowned a new Mwami, Kigeri V, but the Belgian authorities rejected him. Elections held in 1959 were not recognized by the United Nations, and so new elections were held in 1961, in which Grégoire Kaibanda's ethnicist Parmehutu party won over 70% of the votes. On October 2nd, 1961, Kaibanda's National Assembly voted to abolish the monarchy and voted in a constitution. The existing cleavage between Hutu and Tutsi became more pronounced when the Parmehutu militia, organized by the Belgian Colonel Logiest, killed tens of thousands of Tutsi and forced over 150,000 people into exile into neighboring countries. Tutsi houses were burned and cattle killed as the people fled. My grandfather, a medic, was one of those murdered. He had been chased from one post to another during that time. He had refused to swear an oath of allegiance to the government, citing the UN refusal to recognize it. In March 1962, he was picked up at a friend's home and shot 3 times. His wife witnessed the shooting. His son, my uncle André, says that his mother was haunted by these shots and by the sight of her husband's body being dragged away, never to be seen again. My grandfather's murder was not an isolated incident by any means. As Randall Fegley writes, hidden in the euphoria of independence and a revolution that empowered Rwanda's majority, a genocide began that would not be recognized by the world for another 35 years. That was the context in which these stories were collected. The tape-recorded ibitekerezo were transcribed, translated, and carried away ultimately coming to rest at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the United States, where Vansina completed his career as a prolific author and distinguished professor emeritus. In 1973, the 5,400 pages of typewritten text in the Vansina collection was transferred onto 6 rolls of microfilm. One copy was stored in the United States Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Another went to the Africa Museum, then Royal Museum for Central Africa, in Tervuren, Belgium. I accessed the microfilms. So this piece is called The Archive and the Stock. I accessed the microfilms in 2005 through the library at Concordia University in Montreal, where I was very active in a community university research project. Years earlier, an uncle spoke to me about the archive of pre-colonial stories, and it had piqued my interest. As soon as I received the 6 little boxes, I went up to the 4th floor of the library where the microfilm readers were, and I sat down with these strange objects. My mind offers up une bobine, in French, to describe the solid piece of plastic the microfilm is rolled around. One end of the film slides onto a peg, and then you slide the film under a glass and feed it onto another reel. You lift a lever, drop it, turn a crank, and push a button, and the film starts winding, and on the screen appears an image of the file. I saw typewritten pages faded in places, some maps, more pages, and then the first story of the collection, written in phonetically transcribed Runyarwanda like this. Kigwa Nuwa Kazi Niwe Kierezo. The French translation is as follows. Kigwa est le fils de Kazi. Kazi, c'est lui Kierezo. It means Kigwa, son of Kazi, known as Kierezo. And even though some things were written in English and some in French, both languages I'm fluent in, I could not take anything in. I tried several times, and finally I sent the tapes back, but I never let go of the desire of one day exploring and making something with those stories. That first encounter with the archives was over a decade, a long time ago. Several times since then, I have faced the same feeling of not being able to take anything in. Most recently, during my research with life stories, especially my own family's stories, I called this feeling the stuck. For the longest time, I thought it meant something was wrong with me, that I was unwell. I have spent almost 3 decades seeking wellness. I have sought it through research creation, religious studies, psychotherapy, community arts, arts-based approaches to memory, life story work, and oral histories with living witnesses. Throughout this time, I kept encountering the stuck. When I was an undergraduate, the stuck was an existential dilemma, like Shakespeare's to be or not to be. I resolved to be. Through religious studies, I found a framework to think and live with. Life as the in-between of birth and death, the sacred and the profane as qualities of experience, myth and ritual to navigate the sacred and enchant the profane, time and space as access to orient, liminal space to trouble it all. In graduate school, I borrowed Jean Cocteau, La difficulté d'être, or the struggle with being, to express the stuck I was feeling and working through it, and worked through it in my master's thesis on counseling. I practiced as a psychotherapist for several years, then realizing the limits of psychotherapy in relation to the social and political dimensions of the wellness I was seeking for myself and my clients, I embarked on life story work. More specifically, embodied an art-based practice and centered the work on my Rwandan family and community. I have spent the last many years and more exploring what was wrong with us. And when I speak of us, I think of my family, my community, my country of origin. As I read this essay in progress, I'm struck by this idea I had of things being, in quotation, wrong with me or with us. I no longer agree. A trauma-informed perspective asks instead, what happened to us? My family history, like so many other Rwandans, has been greatly affected by Rwanda's century of colonial and missionary dispossession, imprisonments, persecutions, assassinations in the 1950s and 60s, exile and migration, war and genocide. Many like me, born after 1970, especially those raised in the diaspora, were raised with both these challenges, traces, and confounding silences. For me, it created an existential malaise. It was better to understand what such silences were made of. It was to better understand what such silences were made of that I undertook the Montreal Life Stories project and then my PhD. Oral history with living witnesses has allowed me to inquire into the historical events in Rwanda up until the generation of my grandparents. In my PhD, I centered the knowledge contained in or made from these stories. I spent a long time trying to find the words to articulate an epistemological contribution I could make. I worried that my contribution was very subjective, and I didn't know whether the disciplines or the academy might recognize it. But in the end, I crafted my own understanding of this knowledge, and it was different from the history and stories told about me and mine by scholars, missionaries, journalists, and other experts that serve their interests and never our own. In the aftermath of large-scale political violence, seeking wellness became the centering and valuing of lived knowledge and the making of voice and authority. In 2019, I was able to go back to the archive of stories. How much time do I still have?
You have some time.
Yeah.
Make it 2 or 3 minutes.
Through Concordia University libraries, I accessed the microfilms setting that microfilm set again, and they even made arrangements with the Center for Research Libraries to digitize these thousands of pages of text written in Runyarwanda, French, and English. When I encountered these stories the second time, the stuck was still there, but this time I was not alone. My friends and fellow artists, Ursula Neuerborg and Ramona Benveniste, and I had created an artists collective called Seedings. Together we explored the first story in the archive, the story of Kigwa. The Kigwa story is Rwanda's origin story. Kigwa was born of the heart of Mana, the multicolored sacrificial bull. He was born of the longing of his mother, the barren queen Gasani, to have a child. Through a ritual involving milk being poured into a jar onto the heart still attached to the lung, the heart became child. Kigwa did not know he was not the biological son of Gasani's husband, King Kazi. When his origin was revealed to him, Kigwa was crushed and left the kingdom, convinced that those whom he thought of as brothers would not recognize him as their own. When he left, he was accompanied by 2 women and a man, a bull, a cow, some sheep, a rooster, a hen, some doves, and other animals. He and his followers wandered for a long time until he finally chose a place to settle down. Kigwa is the ancestor of all Rwandans, or so it goes. I don't know if I should continue or if we should keep going with the other.
You wanted to read the last bit, right? I think
the last bit.
Yeah. Go on.
Okay, so what I wanted to tell you about we organized the conference. When we started working with these stories, we organized the conference, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about this conference, about the people that I met in Rwanda organizing this conference. There was a man called Kanyandekwe who said, not in English, but he said, "If I hear a cattle herder sing his song, I will know where he comes from. In the east, it is flat. There are rivers. In the west, there are mountains and wells. He, though the cattle herder, will sing a different song if he drives his cows to the river to get water, or if he digs a well." To Vansina, the stories he collected held historical value if critically handled. To me, the stories are traces, portals, traces of the time before, and portals into reflection and creation. But also and especially, the stories are symbols of resistance to the violence of history in a nation that has been violently rent. For diasporic me, raised elsewhere, working with those stories I am a part of, or that are a part of me, has meaning. My work is one of remembering, of creating an inalienable relationship with my story and history. I'm inquiring deeply into relationships, encounters, and learnings that emerge from my intuitive work with stories. It's an exploration, a doing before thinking, and a feeling before doing. Rather than engaging only the usual themes in relation to Rwanda, I wanted to think beyond familiar categories. Sorry. I had thought in the beginning to talk to you about this last piece. The conference took place online on June 8th and 9th, 2022, during International Archive Week, bringing together traditional scholars and artists, informal scholars, local youth, and Rwandan youth in the diaspora. Its focus was to connect people interested in working with archives, heritage, and culture so that we could get to know each other and present our work to each other. It was also an opportunity to meet elders and local experts and to hear sometimes challenging reflections, like the idea by the Honorable Charles Wisenga that colonial archives are not our archives, or to hear the presentation by Albert Rudatsimburgwa on how the initial transcription of Runyarwanda from the oral to the written by non-speakers inadequately grouped sounds into quote-unquote words, thereby obfuscating the language's internal logic and creating a written language that no longer affords modern Runyarwanda speakers access to all of the ideas, concepts, and roots available to our elders to think and create with. 5 generations of Rwandans presented over 2 days. It was challenging to find a language of communication. The older Rwandans were schooled in French, while the younger people spoke English. Not everyone spoke Runyarwanda. Elder and Professor Emeritus Gamariel Bonimana, Sr., shared a concern for intergenerational transmission intrinsic to Rwandan oral tradition. He taught us about narratives and about different interpretive lenses, historical and psychohistorical, mythical or symbolic. He taught us the ways in which Rwandan myth and history are grounded in the land, in rivers and lakes and volcanoes, in trees and in animals. He gives us examples of the ways the different lenses reveal different aspects of a historical character. He sang pieces of the classical traditional repertoire and talked about different types of narrative, the different ways children were raised to sing and remember, and how it came together over time. He challenged how many songs were lost in the colonial transcription of oral tradition because no one wrote down the music, or the music could not be written down, or because no one wanted us to remember. He mentioned a colleague who had passed away. She had known many of the songs that he had wanted us to find and gather before they disappeared. The conference opened avenues I had not anticipated. It allowed me to see how much work is being done, not with the stories I'm working with, not just with them. I met people I fell in love with, like Jean-Pierre Kanyandekwe, who taught me Rwandan culture as a culture of listening to where life is, asking, how did Rwandans know where to build their homestead? And I listened. When they found a place where they wanted to build, they took a branch of a specific tree and made a stake to put into the ground. The piece above the surface would be tied to a long wick and covered in a specific oil or grease and left for a time. If, upon their return, specific insects had eaten at the wick and grease, that meant that there was life, and it was therefore a good place to make a home. Kanyandekwe's idea of being able to identify where a herder is from based on the song they sing, and his insistence that there are many different ways to sing a song based on the singer's living conditions, echoed the work of the youth group Ikiringo and their quest to travel across the country and document different ways and forms of cultural expression. A different narrative becomes available if, as Ikiringo suggests, we listen to different stories and different voices, if we listen to people talking about their own ways in their own terms, in ways that have nothing to do with being Hutu or Tutsi. These ways relate instead to the land and the waters and the plants and the animals and the ways in which we live in different environments. leave it here.
Thank you, Lisa. We'll now turn to Yasmin. And I'm thinking a lot about questions of land. And I know your piece kind of speaks about silence, about land. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Nushat. Thank you, Lisa. Speaking of music, I'm going to read from my piece Rust, and it starts on music. I'm not going to read from the beginning, but this is part of the section from On Music. When the panic comes, there's a sour ball that creeps up from your abdomen and lungs. It trembles like a monster inside and gnaws through your esophagus. You taste it in your mouth and you try to swallow it, push it down. And often in these cases, it is only language that can alleviate the dull pain. Pain that is not sharp enough to kill you, but blunt enough to hurt. Ne is a combination of words you hear often in Helada, Hellas, land of the Hellenes, or Greki, as Romans called the ancient tribes from Helada. Ne is yes in Greek, but sounds like no in Northern Europe. How does a soothing, reassuring mixture of words and music become a word to deter people from doing things? A negation of sorts? I forgot who it was, Veblen or some other translator of the human psyche, that said, it is the little joys and catastrophic miseries of others that we can sympathize with, but never the grander joys or more trivial sorrows. Where the big joys of the South, the triple sound of reassurance, rendered a trivial, mundane sorrow for the North, too large to stare at, without turning them into a hurdle, like a deer rendered into a tiger, one that glides and one that stupefies. Is this how we construct ourselves by nonchalantly replacing letters and words to better grasp life? Or is it the opposite? Is it language that traps us? It's hard to be sure, but I do know that when I want to feel authoritative, I speak Hebrew naturally. To be neutral and semi-intellectual, I speak French. I play around with its peculiar music. In my mind, English is innocent grounds. That's how I grew up with it. I would later find out that it was anything but. We're still trapped in that sense of English. We grow up with films and stories in English, and the entire functioning of the world is introduced to us in English. To survive, we must translate almost anything and everything into English, sometimes even the rhythm of our thoughts. And so it becomes the way we think, the way we write, the way we talk to ourselves, the way we dream. And so Arabic remains a dreamless jumble of love, melancholy, nostalgia, and an inability to properly express ourselves, or anything for that matter. An obsession with accents, stump travels, and halted communal growth, mother tongues, and beautiful people that we could never meet. Arabic is all the moments snatched away by borders, colonization, and other languages that descended on us from heaven, or some in-between hell. Arabic is all the jokes we couldn't tell, the stories we couldn't share or co-create. It is all the cities and towns we had to leave and resettle and rebuild, all the places we were forced to call home. Arabic will never be innocent. Arabic will always trap us, whether we know it or not. The fact, that is, not the language. Other languages might offer the privilege of playfulness. We might be able to escape them, mold them into whatever we like. But Arabic, to me, will always be there, like a little ghost, friendly and ready to help sometimes. It keeps you company, but terrifies and suffocates you at times in all the mischances it carries. All the poetry it could have unfolded, but never did. How does one wear it without being strangled? How does one translate oneself with utterances so randomly composed, yet so historically hefty? But then, it is exactly this language business, any language, that reminds us of history at all, that stands witness to it, traces our past, and entertains our present. It is exactly language that stops us from being goldfish with short-term sorrows but no record of our joys. Perhaps the answer is in the repositioning of our keyboards, in an H that refuses to type when first pushed down, where its Aleph counterpart hides in plain sight. A playful mistake here, a misplaced letter there. Maybe this is the little crack that allows for an escape, if that's what we desire, that is. On landscape. Millions of years ago, almost the entirety of the landmass on Earth was held in one continent, Pangaea. In Greek, it means all the Earth. 140 million years ago, Gondwana, the supercontinent that held what is today South America and Africa together, among others, was split up by cold and warm currents and other speculative effects and created the Atlantic Ocean. If they hadn't been separated, would translation have been needed to translate one to the other? Never mind colonization and the division of the two continents into Dutch, English, French, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and what have you. Would they have needed translation, or better yet, colonization, where need is of course used in irony, if they had remained one? Is landscape the first shaper of how we translate? Are the mountains that separate us players in the way we feel, think, and listen to words? Then, as a side note, does the geography of a question carry more of an answer within it? Are questions meant to wonder or to translate? Were questions and answers once a Gondwana, now separated by this ocean of question marks? And how do questions arrive? Why do we entertain them? Are they a hermaphrodites wandering half, its ancient spirit? Aquí estamos, Hiyana in Arabic. In Chile, possibly Mapudungun for where the land ends or the deepest point of the earth. When you ask how one is, here we are is their answer. Aquí estamos. In vernacular Arabic, or at least in Palestine, Hiyana, aquí estamos, answers that same question. Is it because they were once so close on that mega continent? Or is it because Palestinian merchants and investors arrived in Chile to escape the First World War and change not only Chile's landscape and access to views and resources, but also the people's speech mannerisms? Words externalize our music, they open us up. As long as we live connected interior lives, only music comes out. Sounds in constant flux that never come out the same. Words make sense of that chaos inside, but while music thrives off a certain interior order, external order annihilates our music. To preserve a text, a street, a tree, in an act of translation, the latter must preserve its internal music, and if it's been annihilated, then act to revive it. Jokes. Don't laugh if you don't find things funny. If you're angry, don't speak it, translate it. To speak is to recite, to translate is to show. Be silent more often. Silence, too, is an act or an ancient act of translation. Musical in essence, magnificent in power. It amalgamates centuries of rhythm like black absorbs all color. In silence, the interior respects another exteriorized music and quiets down, and reverence of a fallen pine cone, of a pigeon scurrying across a zinc rooftop, of a fire in the making. Acts of translation must absorb before they can sing. Details can then organically emerge or merge. While aesthetically pleasing, lone details are probably insignificant. When joined by others in humor, rhythm, or geography, they construct mountains as mustard seeds move them. Artemis. Never mistrust anyone with words. One carries one's homeland and language like an ambassador. One can't play around with their language too much, lest it scorches their hometown. What is a mother tongue? It must be the images one sees come out of their mother or mothers, however they manifest in that child's community, mouthing shapes and rhyming out sound vibrations to make the words that shape a human's understanding and thus future translations. It is home. It is the home one finds and refines, wherever they see or hear similar forms. They feel comfort in its rhythm. It is an invitation to mouth circles with smoke and spring in an era of understanding. An understanding so basic it dissipates into thin air, so profound it cannot linger for more than a split second. Of light years, or whichever planetary energy time is emitted from. Chariots and cards. The minute chosen for translation shapes it. It is part of that translation's geography. It sculpts it, like winds erode mountains into rugged sketches. A minute, a form of Cronus, and like it, born of earth and water, can later bring forth aether, chaos, and phanies. An upper sky, a primordial void, and a hermaphrodite. It is the Atlantic Ocean that separates one potential from another. It is to choose one warring notion over the other. It builds rhythms like one accompanies music with one's foot, by one's heartbeat, its past of walking and dancing. It engraves pathways like a chariot headed for victory, like water currents split land masses. It draws energies and erases others. To translate is to anticipate a compass and look everywhere for its chronology, creating bliss, mess, and new ways of being. Love in the cards. Disappointment is translation too. It is the mind's visualization unmatched, unapplied, invisibilized, blocked. It is the failure to see with one's eye, feel with one's hands, heart, its own writing on the mind's retina. It is a music composed that failed to play, failed to beat well, or play long enough. Disappointment in French is déception, or déception, but in Spanish. Both allude to a form of tricking, deception. It is to be deceived, hurt by the ill translation of a vision sown and watered, which then withered or finished into a magician's cap of illusions, hence disillusionment. To love Palestine is to love a trick one never touches, yet keeps constructing time and again, well, in the hope that one day, the translation will hold for longer than a split second. Thank you.
Thank you, Yasmin. I invite everyone who is listening to please go and read these beautiful essays. I was rereading all of them this morning, and there is so much in there, and I'm so grateful to everyone who's written. And there's a lot more than just about language and translation. Nidra, will you take us to the end?
Thank you, Nuzhat and Lisa and Yasmin. It's so beautiful to, I feel so privileged to sit here and listen to you. I'll maybe start with a couple of some stories that will help contextualize the thing I'm going to read, because I'm a bit of a theory head, and when I write, so the stories help ground them, I think, materially. One is last month, a poet that I translate is a poet, a novelist, and screenplay writer, Tiba Chalban, had his most recent novel, Payangravadi, Terrorist, I translate the title as Terrorist, was translated from Tamil to Sinhala. And last month he was taken in and held by the police under the Prevention of Terrorism Act because the police wanted to interrogate him about the protagonist of the story. They wanted to know where this person lives and, who is helping them and so on. So this idea of like the inability to tell between fact and fiction. And this is someone who's writing as a way of trying to sort of who wanted his work translated into Sinhala to help bring about some healing between the Tamil and Sinhala communities. And so that. And another translator I work with, as I was beginning to translate his poems, he mentioned to me that back in the 80s, when he also worked as a journalist for a newspaper, he would be, every time they had to deliver the newspaper, before they were allowed to deliver it, he was taken in to the police station and someone would translate the newspaper while he was held in custody. And then, if they thought it was okay, they were allowed to distribute it. So, this experience of translating can be a very fraught thing for people living under oppression. But to contrast that with a story of a friend of mine who works as a translator at refugee hearings told me that he often asks people going through the hearing process to speak in Tamil and to have a translator there, because even if they're fluent in English, just that moment of having a translation gives them a little bit of respite so that they can pause, because often they're narrating very traumatic things, and this just gives them a little bit of space. So when I think of decolonizing translation, that's what I think about. I think of these colonial forces that sort of can use translation as a way to surveil and to monitor people. And translation used in a way to sort of provide healing or to provide safe spaces. So as the moves to, so I'm reading from my essay, Crossing Terrains. As the moves to Sinhalicize place names of traditionally Tamil areas become normalized, and Google searches no longer reveal Tamil names, translated works hold the possibility of being repositories for rhizomes of cultural and historical intersections, for words that possess meanings excluded by the dominant language. The rhizome repositories appear most vividly as I return to translate Rashmi's long poem, E Thanathu Perai Marandu Ponathu, E Forgot Its Name, after a hiatus. Rashmi's use of East Coast Tamil was already a challenge for a Colombo Tamil like me, and I had to draw on distant memories of childhood trips to the East before the embargoes were put in place to think through the cadence of his poetry. Compounding the difficulty was the poet's occasional use of archaic Tamil terms interspersed with neologisms, and the difficulty of translating the horrors of war that had no precedent in Tamil tradition. Close to abandoning this work, I only returned to it after a space of time when I had read his more recent poetry. There in the landscape was the key that gave me a small point of entry to the translation. I went back to edit the section titled Talayatigalin Kalam, the time of the scarecrows. The east coast of Sri Lanka has folkloric tales and practices associated with two kinds of scarecrows. Talayati, the one that nods or assents, and Viriti, the one that frightens. I'll just read the translation. They saw, one day past and the next day, a little past midnight, in the paths where Erikalai and Kalli remain, where Adamban vines spread, where Nirunji pierced their bare feet, they awaited their turn, and they saw death. Rashmi's poem draws from eyewitness accounts of people herded away by the army for execution after being identified as rebels by a taleati or scarecrow, with a sack over his head to preserve his anonymity. The accused are forced to travel through an arid landscape that signifies separation, one where prickly vegetation reflects the physical and psychic tortures that lie ahead. While the Naranji plant is used in many herbal remedies, here it is only a source of torment. In the poem, the natural world and livelihood are intrinsically woven. And in the extended poem, the names of towns and villages synonymous with artisanal practices have become trademarks. The herbalists of Karaitivu, the vegetation of Kaladavale, and the artisans of Marudamune are interlocked in relations evolving from the land. These are also towns and villages with large Muslim populations, where violence was perpetrated on their communities. In Susan Blight's words, I find respite. I think we need to take a moment to appreciate what it takes for a people not to forget, when everything in the dominant culture wants us to forget, sometimes violently forced us to forget, created conditions in which it was easier for us to forget. Rashmi's poem maps without hierarchies the histories of Muslims during the protracted war, with the place names acting as rhizomes to unlock a wide array of links between ancestral villages, indigenous border villages, folk practices, relationships to the landscape, and the histories of violence, a once thriving life replaced by torture camps. The poem washes over the reader, refusing to forget the loss and the despairing knowledge of not a street free of mourning. The poem is not a closed book, and in holding on to these Tamil names through transliteration rather than finding an anglicized substitute, I may allow a tear or tear to trickle through the strictures of a dominant power. I do not see my translation practice as seamless or perfect. I entered it with a sense of urgency to translate works that I thought would be useful for a younger generation of Tamil scholars and artists growing up in diaspora. I have come to accept that my practice was always contend with a there and a here. There, in a place and time in the past, is my mango tree. I don't know if it was cut down in the years following my departure from that house, that town, that country. I recall that mango tree every time I pick up a mango and smell the sap in the scar where it was broken from stem and tree. I know that something of it lives on there in that soil, and across time and place in the here, it lives in me. It has formed me and it has formed my practice. Here, the mango saturates global literature and moringa pills crop up in health food stores. The mango and moringa are known objects to people who have never seen or smelled their trees. It's the same for olives, right? And olive oil and olive trees. It is these contradictions and exclusionary meanings that permeate my work. In my translations, anglicized names of flora extracted for a global market sit unsettled beside Tamil names for flora not yet extracted, beside disappearing Tamil place names, the names of old herbal ointments and artisanal practices. Still, to dwell in a practice that conveys only a sense of there implicates me in a dominant culture's path, to forget the mappings of the here. I am here both refugee and settler, and my practice is also informed by the here. In Leaks, the song from which the epigraph to this essay is drawn, Leanne Simpson reminds a child, her descendant, "You are from a place of unflinching power, the holder of our stories, the one who speaks up." Interspersed with her calls to power are traces of violence, wounds, and failures. The poem reminds me that as I translate works about violence down there, I must guard against doing violence here, to her descendant. Perhaps this is the ethical quandary the Vedalam has placed upon me, to ask how we may unearth meanings that gather us together, where forest is flint, fodder, love song, medicine, beyond the tracing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nidra. Each time I hear all of you read, it just grabs me again. Like I remember the first time when I encountered all your writings, how much it helped me to think. And I know there's life to these essays. They keep on making us rethink many, many things. Um, we have about 15 minutes left, and we have a wonderful audience. And I was wondering, dear audience, who I can't see, if you would like to put in your questions in the Q&A, so we can also interact with you. While you're doing that, I'm going to just ask Lisa and Yasmin and Nidra to think through perhaps a little more, speak a little bit more about something I noticed in all their pieces, which was sort of a tension between speaking and silence, between translation as resistance, but also the kind of thing that Nidra was speaking about, where translation can be also an instrument of power. So can we start just a little bit with thinking through silence in each of your work? Who would like to start? Lisa?
A lot of the work that I've been doing has had to do with silence, or with the pieces that are not accessible, the pieces that are not visible, the pieces that are behind, the pieces that you can't see for everybody continues, even though so much is crumbling, so much has fissures, and the fissures in history reflect in the stories of families, the relationships people have to life and living, to community, to their relationships with future, with I think that I saw the invitation to be a part of this work, and the idea of thinking about translation. There was translation and transmediation, like translation into language, but also translation into play. Like a lot of when we were working with life stories, for example, there were a lot of the work that we did was through I'm thinking about playback theater, for example, and even the work that we did with the stories. It became real when we could pass it, for me anyway, when we could pass it through the body, when we I couldn't even access language before playing with it, and then having, and then words coming, silence was something that was protective for children, but then it was also, there's so many different things in there that, yeah, there's silences, and then there's interpretations of things that, and so much friction.
Mm-hmm. Yasmin?
I'm thinking of silence right now in the sense of, well, I also grew up with silence as a 1948 Palestinian, with all the privileges of the Palestinians who grew up in 1948 territories, occupied in 1948. So we learn silence so much, and we excel at it. We just learn to observe rather than speak up. Whereas in the other different territories of Palestine and exiled Palestinians, it's a different relationship to silence. So I think I learned to internalize that also in my translation. But I'm also thinking of the current moment where translating Palestine is silencing other places in the world as well. Like, I cannot stop myself from thinking that. where it should be more of joining hands, or not silencing, but it is an act of translation to what's happening now in Palestine. And it's a totally different story from Sudan, from Congo, from other catastrophed places in the world, for very similar and sometimes also different reasons. We have to be nuanced. But I think of the translation of our places and how they can collaborate with each other, rather than, I'm not sure compete is the word, but yeah, more play music together, or remain in silence together. I'm not even sure I'm very clear with my thought process right now, but yeah, that is my thought on silence and translation, on a personal note, but also on a more global note, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Nidra?
I think I kind of want to think of the flip side of silence, which is maybe an enforced silence, where, because there's a period where we talk about these events, like, the war in Sri Lanka, often described as a war without witnesses, for instance. And it's not that there weren't witnesses to it, right? So there's a manufactured kind of silence, a collective sort of international gaslighting of what goes on. And I see that happening in the present too, because there is so much so much news we get from Sudan, from the Congo, and I mean, Palestine is particularly visible, I think, in social media that I'm exposed to. And yet there seems to be a kind of, silence around it, as if that there's a whole realm of people for whom this doesn't exist. So I guess it's that space into which I kind of want to insert translation. But also, I love what you described, Yasmin, that this sort of solidarity, this linking hands in this process of translation, just to move away from that oppressive gaze and to speak to each other, which in many ways, that's what this book allowed us to do. It allowed us to read each other and speak to each other from a different position of different investment in translation, from that kind of position of surveillance or oppression. So that I guess makes me hopeful.
We have one question, and I think we'll only have time to answer that before we wrap up for today. The question's directed to Yasmin, but perhaps if we have time, all three of you can answer, but we only have 5 more minutes left, and I will have to wrap up soon. But the question is, thank you for all your beautiful readings. Yasmin, you mentioned translating place. Could you speak more on that? Just in terms of how and through what mediums a place can be translated, and how that in turn changes our relationship to it. And I think that's kind of at the core of all the work in this book as well. So Yasmin, I think we'll go with you.
Thank you for the question. My first reaction would be silence to answer this question. I'm not so sure how to begin, but I would again go back to music, to the rhythms of the place, like listening to the rhythms, being in tune constantly with the rhythm of the place, of its people, of the different languages spoken in that place, and then trying to either bring that to life in a new text or in a new sentence or in a new music, or try to mirror it in your own collective but also personal way, but mainly collective. Yeah, the collective cannot be taken out of place, so you start with the collective and its music.
Thank you. Nidra, I'll go with you next.
Oh, it was very interesting to me to listen to how all three of us talked about landscape, right? How landscape sort of wove its way into it. And I loved that our three landscapes are sort of speaking to each other. And I think for me that those are the ways in which place comes across. And I think also the way I do it, and I kind of hinted at it in the section I read, is to retain some of the original, the Tamil names for flora, especially because those trees have so much meaning in the culture. And to, if I don't like the idea of using some Latin name for it or some anglicized name for it, because it kind of deresonates it, no pun intended, from that context, right? So I think that's the way in which I try to bring place across.
Lisa?
I have a very I'm just starting relationship with place. I was always elsewhere, and so my relationship was mostly with people. And so what I loved about, for example, when the elder was talking about the different ways in which people were talking about their environment and what how they sing themselves, how they how they see what they do, and how they there's a lot of, so to me, I guess translate it's to Yasmin said something about being able to retain the song, the music in one from one realm to another realm. It's to retain the what it evokes, right? And I think that those are the different difficult things. Like when Kanyandekwe, for example, was telling me about where the herder has, if he comes from the east or the west, because he's going to give the cows water differently, and he's going to have a different song, and you can recognize where the person comes from their song. How do you translate the love of the cattle in the what I like? I don't know how to, if I'm making myself clear. Like there's so many pieces to so many threads to go with, to like the place for whom means what.
Okay, we'll have to end there. Thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure for me to listen to all of you today. Thank you all so much for being here in this mysterious audience out here. I know a lot of people in UK and Europe want to have the book. We can mail it from here, but it does take time and it often doesn't arrive fully. We can do it to the UK. We've had problems sending the book to Europe, but we are trying, and we think in about a month we will have our books available in Europe and the UK. So in the meantime, those of you who are in North America, it's much easier. The book is available in any bookstore. But thank you all so much. We invite you to join this sort of collective questioning that we're all embarked on together, because I think translation, even in the current moment, needs to be decommodified and to change in the way we listen to each other across our different languages and our different ears. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. And thanks again to BCLT, to the National Center for Writing, and Mayada, and the audience, and our wonderful speakers today.